Help us, O God, to hear these words for all that they are. Enable us to hear so that our hearts might be moved. Set us free from the ways of empire thinking that leads us to believe that we have the best or last word on your word. Send your Spirit to liberate us from the prisons of arrogance and ignorance, and set us free to live more fully and to love more fully because of these words, your word. Amen. We're reading from the prophet Micah, familiar words. Let us listen for what the Spirit may be speaking at our hearing. Micah 6, chapter 6, verses 6 through 8. With what shall I come before the Lord? And how and bow myself before God on high? Shall I come before God with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000s of rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, and the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? God has told you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, and to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God? This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. It's a little over 2 years ago, at the Union Council worship service in the honor of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. that we hosted in this place, when the Reverend Dr. Ben Sanders stood up and challenged us and all those who were gathered to listen to the voices of our ancestors. He went on to say that some of those voices we will need to reject and others we will need to embrace. And I think given the events of our own time, it's even more timely. The rise of income inequality, the backlash of white supremacy, and so much more. And so it seemed appropriate to me to listen to the witnesses of others who had faced similar circumstances in different ages. And so we're going to figure out how we listen to all three of these prophets, some of whom you are familiar with, others maybe not as much. Micah. You know, it's easy to get those two tripped up. They have similar themes. Most of the prophets do, right? Justice for the widow, the poor, the orphan. So we can listen to the prophets of the Bible and the prophets of all ages. The Reverend Henry Highland Garnett and Ida B. Wells Barnett. When Micah came to power, or when Micah came on the scene, he was called to preach. The truth was, the economy was better than it had been in a long time. The nation was strong and rich. However, it was only those at the top of the society who benefited from the booming economy. What we know is that justice was only available to those who could afford it. For the poor, the widow, the immigrant, not only were they left to fend for themselves, they were used to prop up a system which further oppressed them. And the religious leadership, they stood by and stood with the immoral political leadership. And then they claimed that this immorality was God's own arrangement. I'm still talking about the 8th century. The prophet Micah was called by God in the midst of this mess to call it out for what it was, immoral, and not what God intended. What we know about him is unclear fully, but what we know clearly was that his message was undeniable. And when he said things like, God has told you, O mortal, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God, the priests called him a liar. And the political leadership said at various times that he was undermining the morale of the troops and hurting national pride. In all times and places, the loving justice of God is so often met with disdain by those who pervert justice and want to put God's name on it. I know, still talking about the 8th century. And when the Reverend Henry Highland Garnet was born, it too was a time of perverted justice. And then they had the church saying that all of it was God's plan for the world. He was born in 1850 in Maryland. And his family escaped enslavement in 1824, and they moved to New York, and his life changed forever. He went to college, went to seminary, and in 1842 became a Presbyterian minister. A radical voice for justice, and he never left this majority white church that never could quite seem to know what to do with him. He was a powerful voice for the justice of God. He had a calling upon his life, the calling to the church and calling to the nation, to call it to account for the ways that it had not denied the full humanity of his people, the way that it had denied God's liberation for all people. He understood that to be at the heart of the gospel. And at the heart of his preaching was the belief that God's plan was that all human beings were made free in body, mind, and spirit. He worked early on with the other abolitionists, and his powerful preaching skills to seek to bring about the end of the institution of slavery. However, his call to abolition was slightly different than the rest, which kind of made him a troublemaker. It was in 1843 at the National Negro Conference he got up and preached a speech called Call to Rebellion. Unlike other abolitionists who were hoping to sway white folks into changing the institution of slavery, in that sermon he called out and preached to other enslaved people and said it was not only their right, but duty to God to resist, to kill their masters. It's amazing he doesn't end up on the front page of most of the conversations around abolitionists. In fact, at the time, Frederick Douglass and others were trying to silence him. Reverend Garnet shocked them by this call to open rebellion, but it did not sway him from his sense of call. He knew something about the reality of the institution that the abolitionists had not yet figured out. It was going to take blood to end it. He had a call from God and was willing to speak what he knew to be true despite pushback. He was not wrong. He absolutely was right. And during his lifetime, particularly during the Civil War, Reverend Garnet was a lightning rod because of the draft riots in New York. At the time, in 1863, he was living in New York City, and then the draft riots came up. An angry mob decided that it was his fault that they were having to go fight a war they wanted no part in, and they hunted him down. Fortunately, he and his family escaped. He then moved to Washington, D.C. and became the pastor of 15th Street Presbyterian Church, and he continued to preach a message that God had placed on his heart. What we know is that he was an inspiration to John Brown and others early on in his ministry. And then, on February 12, 1865, Reverend Garnet stood at the Speaker's dais in the U.S. Congress, being the very first black man in America to speak from there instead of at the corners in the back. And he preached a sermon on that day. They used to have church on Sunday. The chaplain invited him to come and preach. And on that day, from all recorded reports, it was one of the most powerful sermons that people had ever heard. The way in which he melded biblical imagery and social issues of the day and concluded with such power that when he was done, people leapt to their feet and clapped, even though it was the midst of a worship service. He said this: "When and where will the demands of the reformers of this age and coming ages end? Emancipate, enfranchise, and educate" were the 3 points in his sermon. He ended by saying that emancipation required white America to free enslaved people from bondage, not just setting them free, but to do so in the same way that the Israelites were set free from Egypt. That meant reparations. It's right there in Exodus, by the way. He also demanded the vote, at least at that point, for black men, so that they would all be invested in the nation and that the Constitution would actually mean something instead of just a collection of words, all in his sermon. And then he said education. This is not just about formerly enslaved folk, but the white folk who can't seem to get over their racism. 1865. And so then he called to the churches to actually live out the gospel instead of slapping God's name on sin. Throughout his life, he faced pushback for his devotion to the call placed upon his life, much like the biblical prophets. He faced oppositions from friends and foes alike, but he kept going, and he kept working with anybody who would work with him to bring about what he believed would happen. He kept preaching, and he remained faithful to the gospel. And by the end of his life, he was an ambassador for the United States to Liberia. He didn't make it there very long. He died very early on in his time there, but he kept fighting. And here's the thing: his witness is one which we as Presbyterians should not only keep alive, but listen to as a way of being faithful in our own time. So often I hear people say, well, there's nothing we can do. Let's just disconnect. And we can't. Because the biblical prophets, the prophets we're listening to today, often saw none of what they hoped to come to fruition in their own lifetimes, but it did not keep them from going. And so now I want to turn to another Presbyterian. You might not have known that she was a Presbyterian. Her voice of faithfulness in the midst of white backlash to black progress is so critical in our lives today. Some of you might not be aware that Ida B. Wells was a Presbyterian, but she was. I even have her words to prove that that was true. It was when she moved to Chicago after she was married and had young children. She decided that she wanted to raise her children in the church, and she ended up at a Presbyterian church. She wrote this, though: "I was not Presbyterian by doctrine, but since all Christian denominations agreed on a standard of conduct and right living, it seemed to me to matter very little what name we bore. I told them that if they would accept me with that confession of faith, I would come in. They did accept me," she said, "and I and my 2 daughters united with the church. Shortly after that, I was asked to accept the position of the teacher of the men's Bible class by the members themselves." End quote. But the truth about what makes her remarkable and a powerful prophet and witness is not just her time in a Presbyterian church, or that it was the men who came to her and asked her to be a teacher at that time. Wells was a prophet by this point. Now, I'll give you the details. She was born in 1862. But she was raised and kind of came to herself during the period of the Reconstruction, raised by parents who were involved with the Freedmen's Aid Society, and her father founded Shaw University. And by 1882, because of some family tragedies, she ended up moving to Tennessee. She attended Fisk University and eventually found her way to Memphis. She had a power with words, a way to encapture people with the way that she would write. So she became a journalist, even though she wrote under a pseudonym. And over time, not only was she a powerful writer, she was a businesswoman. She ended up owning 3 different newspapers. And all the while she was busy working as a journalist and a business owner, she also worked as an educator for a short time because she got fired, because she reported what was going on with these children because of the deplorable conditions of the schools. Again, we're talking in the late 1800s, not St. Louis today. But then it was in 1892 that her life took on a trajectory that she probably did not know. She was aware, like others, about lynching and how it was a white backlash to the gains made in Reconstruction. And so she began to use her significant gifts to shedding light, that truth would shed light on the evil at the heart of American whiteness. She continued to do so until an angry mob finally had had enough. And they stormed her newspaper. They destroyed everything in it. But fortunately, she was not there. She was traveling to New York at the time, and she said she was getting ready to go back to Memphis, and the newspaper editor at the time she was working with in New York said, "No, you're not, sit down," and showed her the newspaper article. So she redoubled her efforts. She did travel a number of times back into the South, but she did not work from Memphis anymore. Living under the threat of death changed what she was going to do. But it did not stop her from living out her calling to expose this national sin. She traveled throughout the North. She traveled into Europe. She published a book. She wrote an article. She even traveled clandestinely to meet with people and encourage them to fight back, to shed light on what was not an occasional happenstance by some persons unknown, but in fact part of the white regime, a national pastime. She was a powerful and fierce speaker as well. But not just on lynching, but issues of far racing around racial justice, the need to not only engage, but defeat white supremacy and the rights for women. Catherine Meeks and Nib Stroop recently published a book about her, and they believe that the reason that this book is so important is that it is a witness for our time, she being a witness for our time. They said that in every time history has shown us that when progress has been made by African Americans, there is white backlash, white supremacy that will rear its head. We are facing that today. And progress, when they're made on issues of justice, history teaches us that there is always a backlash, so that we should not be surprised, but listen to the witnesses of those who've seen it before us and remain faithful. And they begin the first chapter with these words, and I want to share the entire quote with you. She did the work, quote, she did the work that no one else would do. She kept showing up where she wasn't wanted. She worked with people who would work with her. She worked with people she didn't agree with, and with whom she fought constantly. She worked for the betterment of a country that saw her as a second-class citizen. She lived through some of the darkest times in American history and did not live to see the biggest advancements that her daily work would yield decades later. Yes, she believed in herself and in her ability to get things done, not just for herself, but for her fellow citizens. End quote. Prophets. Prophets from Amos to Micah to Reverend Garnett and to Wells and many others. Each one of them, though, had similar trials. Each faced backlash in their own way. Some lived under the threat of death. And each continued to speak for justice. And each never got to see the end of their hoped-for change. But that did not stop them from pushing forward. And that is why their witness is so important. They remained faithful to the call upon their life. Each one of them had a unique call, and they followed that. And it is their witness, I believe, that's calling us in this time of current backlash of white supremacy to stand up and to figure out what our role will be. It may not be to be the next prophet, but it will be to keep showing up and to not give up and to inspire others and find others to be inspired by love and keep working for an end to that which is not God's plan for all people. It is my hope that we hear them, that we listen to these ancestors, rejecting the other ancestors who are on the wrong side of history. And then my hope is that we might be worthy of their witness and become witnesses ourselves for others who will come behind us saying, "What did you do at that time and place?" and leave a legacy. That is our calling. That is our faith.